Hi, I think the video is just getting loaded. Perfect, I think we are live now. So hi everyone, today is Monday. I hope everyone's week is starting off well. I've got the chat box open, so as always, feel free to introduce yourself if you are here during the live, or also feel free to introduce yourself if you are watching this back. If you are newer to this group, I try to go live with these trainings about every couple weeks. Obviously, with holiday time, vacation time, that's been, I think it might have been 3 weeks since I did the last one. So I'm excited to be back. For those of you who are newer to this group and don't know me, my name is Amanda Baduris. I go by Amanda KB for this group's purposes. And I am a licensed psychologist in Oregon. I have a solo private practice where I do individual work, couples work, and some of the traditional weekly, bi-weekly model of therapy for 45, 60 minutes, as well as intensive therapy work. So I have seen intensives be so significant in terms of changing not only how I work, how I put together my work schedule, but also what I've seen it do for clients. So that's why I'm really excited about sharing this information with you all. I do not want this to feel like a gatekeeping thing because everyone should know how to do intensives. Quite honestly, they should have taught us in grad school how to do intensives, but they didn't because, as we know, we're primarily trained in like an insurance-based model of how to do therapy. So this is why I love coming into this group and just sharing with you all what I know, mistakes I've made, and how I've learned from them, and things that I've seen work really well. So the topic for today is around how to adapt different therapy modalities to intensives. So this comes with a disclaimer that obviously I am not trained in every different type of modality. So some of the specifics I may not be able to get into, but I want to give you some key takeaways that I've found translate whether I'm working with an individual, a couple, talk therapy, emotionally focused couples therapy, or any of the like somatic forms of therapy I do, like EMDR and brain spotting. Because I think, yeah, you don't need me really to tell you hour by hour what to do exactly. So as long as you've got a few kind of guiding questions to think about, you already know how to do the modality that you do. So you'll know how to best adapt it. And again, I'll share some of my insights of what's worked well, what hasn't worked well either. So throughout the course of this training, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat throughout and I will monitor it throughout. Sometimes the chat gets lost. I'm not sure how that happens, but I think I've got it open and functioning for today. And if you are catching the recording, feel free to just live comment as you're watching, so I'll get to see the timestamp and where you all had questions, and I will answer those ASAP. So when it comes to you are trained in X modality or modalities, how do I take that and how I've been doing that in 45, 50, 60 minutes and translate it to an intensive? So a lot of that is going to come down to these few questions I want you to think about. So number one, how much time do you have for your intensive? Because people qualify a lot of different things as an intensive, whether that's, well, instead of 60 minutes, we're doing 75. Well, instead of 60, we're doing 90, or instead of 60, we're doing 4 hours. So number one, how much time do you have with this person or with this couple, this partnership, however you work with people? How much time do you have? And not just on that given day, but in general. So is this someone who has booked like a 2-day intensive with you and that's back to back? Is it someone who says, I want to do a 3-hour intensive once a month? Is this someone who just wants to kind of try out a 90-minute model? So you've got a lot of questions to be thinking about. So then within your modality, you need to be thinking about, okay, how do I translate that into what I'm going to do in that time? Because the simplest shifts, right? If you're already doing something in about 50 minutes, you can do that in 75 to 90 minutes. That's really not a problem. There's probably plenty of times, like I have done in the past, I've gotten better at setting boundaries around it, But there's probably times where you're already scheduled for a 60-minute, and then all of a sudden we're over to 75 and we're over to 90 minutes. So you already know what you're doing. So there's not much adapting that comes to that. Usually I hear therapists get a little bit more stuck when it comes to, well, I've got 3 to 4 hours and I've got, whether it's just that, because that's not just, that's like 3 or 4 hours is a lot of time. Whether it's that, or whether it's, well, I've got a multi-day intensive kind of package booked out. Like, what am I literally doing for that full time? So again, I'm going to guide you through some questions to think about. That first one being, how much time do you have? Because that's probably going to guide a lot of what you're actually doing in terms of how much psychoeducation are you doing? How much skill building are you doing? How much are you focusing on resourcing versus processing or practicing and implementing different communication skills if you're working with a partnership? So, how much time do you have is the first question to think about. And then number two, and this isn't specifically in any order, this is just the way that I thought about it, stream of consciousness. Again, if I'm looking over here, I'm looking at my notes that I prepared for today. So number two, what are the goals for the intensive? So I've had people come to me who have never been in therapy before, whether that's individual or couples, and they say, like, I feel like the intensive model just fits for me. Like, I feel like I just need to do a lot. I feel like I don't have a lot of time to commit to weekly therapy. I feel like we've tried this and it just hasn't worked before. Like, I've had people tell me, they've read this book, they've done this personal retreat that was not like led by a therapist, or they've, done all the things that in theory should work, and yet they're stuck. So what are the goals in the sense of, well, is this kind of just a Kickstarter for therapy generally? Because if so, if someone has never been in therapy before, it's not that it means it's like bad or contraindicated to do any kind of processing or like do the work, so to speak. But it might just mean they need a little bit more psychoeducation. So if someone's new to therapy and they're like, I just kind of want to dive in and like get a lot of work done, remember that part of the work that is getting done is in the event of trauma or betrayal in relationships or whatever that might be, that is typically having someone seek this kind of experience, is that there's a lot going on and they need something to kind of guide them. And resourcing and skills in and of themselves are a thing that, most of us therapists start with anyway. We typically don't dive right in. So if someone is newer to therapy, that can be something that you think about is, okay, maybe they're coming to me because they said, this person does brain spotting therapy. I've never done therapy before, but I've heard brain spotting is like the thing to do. Or I feel like in our relationship, we're really struggling. We've tried reading some books, but we've heard something about this Gottman method or whatever it is. They might come to you for your method, but you as the clinician, depending again on what their goals are they just looking to get started? Or have they done a lot of work and they felt really stuck? Or whatever the case might be. You as the clinician, right, you are doing that treatment planning based on what's the information you're getting in the consultation, what's the information you're getting during the intake, and then you are ultimately deciding like, oh, yes, those modalities might eventually be helpful for them, but if they're entirely new to therapy, we might really have to start at these foundations before we get deep into this work. So there are times where people have come to me for EMDR therapy and we get to the intake, which I schedule for 90 minutes. And as they're talking, I'm realizing and they're realizing they're not actually ready for EMDR therapy. So whether that's we just have we have the intake and we actually decide let's not move forward with the intensive, let's hold on for a second, hold on to each other's contact information, we can always come back to that. Or whether you move forward with the intensive session, but very much through the lens of we're not going to focus on processing through all of the trauma. We're actually going to focus on building up some grounding resources. Like, know that that is still just as valid of a way to do intensive therapy, because all intensive therapy is a lot of therapy in a short period of time. So that's still a part of therapy, right? Is to build up what's going on, how do we connect some dots, How do we get you grounded? How do we learn some skills? Like, perfectly valid way to spend 3 to 4 hours. So, goals for therapy, are they new or are they really stuck and struggling with something? So if they're really stuck and struggling with something, again, depending on what you might be trained in, you probably already are aware of a different type of protocol. I know EMDR, ART, even ERP, a lot of those have different protocols that you might work with. So that's going to give you a little bit of some guidance depending on different like couples work. I'm familiar-ish with Gottman, and I'm trained in emotionally focused therapy. So they're going to have some guidance as well around like, okay, here's the things that you're going to be really targeting. So you're going to have that sense of here's what we're targeting depending on here's what we're talking about in that consultation and in that intake appointment. But then you want to be thinking about like also what is the individual or the partnership? What are they saying is their goal for the intensive? And that's again where your clinical reasoning comes into play around, I hear us talking about this, but thinking about the time we have together, whether that's we only have 3 hours or we only have 2 days, which in a couples intensive, like really doesn't feel like that much time. You can do good work in it, but it goes by really quickly. So we've only got this amount of time. I'm feeling like we might want to focus a little bit more on this in order to get you the best benefit. Or, we can kind of do some kind of collaborative treatment planning. It's not like their goals don't matter, but it is important that you're sharing what do you think is achievable for them or not. Because someone who might be coming to me, I specialize specifically in complex trauma, someone who's coming to me saying, I want all my stuff to be done in 3 to 4 hours, like I'm going to be honest with them and say, I don't think that's going to happen. I see us getting through these goals, and maybe we continue to work intensively. Maybe if you have a different therapist, if I'm doing adjunct therapy, or maybe we talk about getting you like a routine therapist established, whatever that might be. But establishing those goals for the intensive, whether someone's just beginning, depending on what their clinical presentation is, things they're wanting to focus on, that's super, super important to consider. As well, I kind of just said that, but are they already working with someone in therapy? Because if they are, that gives you a little bit more wiggle room in terms of what you're adapting. So for example, I saw someone, when was this? I think this was in July. This person has been in twice a week therapy for the past like 5 years with a talk therapist and really, really felt ready to try EMDR or brain spotting. She had been through like, what's the book called? The Seeking Safety group. So she has skills. She had all the awareness of like, this is my trigger for this and this is how this works. She was also working with a psychiatrist. So this person had a ton of supports behind her. So I felt more comfortable with, okay, so we've got 2 days together. Let's just, make sure we're establishing here are our goals. And then we could just kind of dove right into some of the processing. She felt safe enough with me through the consultation and the intake, so we had our rapport established. But when we got to that intensive session day, we just went into processing, and her life has shifted so significantly. It's been amazing. But I would not do that same thing with someone who maybe had similar goals for the intensive, which was to process some complex trauma history, to process some really stressful current life events. I wouldn't do that with someone if they didn't have a solid support system behind them. And that's just my clinical comfort. Yours might be different. But in my mind, if someone's going through some really deep processing, I don't want them to be done just after the intensive with me. So especially me and this person did brain spotting with a little bit of EMDR. That would be a lot of processing into some deep topics without anyone to kind of hand her off to, right? Of like, okay, she's going back to her therapist twice a week. She's got a psychiatrist appointment in 2 weeks. Like knowing that made me more comfortable diving in. If someone is not established, it's not that, again, doing some of the deeper processing work is off limits. It's just you want to be a little bit more mindful of like how might that shape. We might need to do some resourcing first. We might need to set some expectations first, or we could do a little bit of the processing, but maybe it's only for X amount of the intensive versus the whole time of the intensive, because that's a component too that you get to choose. I I haven't done this with this one client in a while, but I used to meet with one of my weekly clients. We did 60 minutes, and then we started moving into once a month, we would do a 90-minute intensive. So for the first like 45 minutes, traditional talk therapy. We're just talking about things, how have things been going, where are you still struggling? And then the rest of the 45 minutes was EMDR. So you can break it up like that too, of having some bits of talk therapy in there and then transitioning in and out of your different modalities that you do. So the big things that comes down to, so those guiding questions, which I kind of muddled 2 through 4 together, but number 1, how much time do you have? So a few hours, a couple days, whatever that might be. 2, what are the goals for the intensive? So the goals that you've set as well as the goals the client is coming in with. Number 3, is the individual or couple already working with another therapist / what other therapy work have they done? Because maybe I've seen one person in an intensive before who had been in therapy for a really long time and just broke up with her therapist like a month before our intensive because she was like, it felt like it was time for us to wrap up anyway. So she still had a good amount of skills done, so I felt still comfortable jumping into the processing with her. And then number 4 is, what is that presenting concern, or how does the client present? Because a client who, again, ones that I've chosen to not move forward with either after the consultation or after the intake, are the ones who are not really resourced, are the ones who are saying they're a little bit more in crisis, they're a little bit overwhelmed with everything. Then that's where I'm assessing the difference between intensive therapy versus intensive outpatient programming. Because as a solo practice provider, there's only so much I can do for a client. I can do an intensive session, but if someone's in crisis and overwhelmed, there's not much that I feel comfortable doing. Again, you may be different, your situation might be different. So those are the 4 things to be thinking about. So again, when you think about your training that you have, is that EMDR, brain spotting, ART, I could list all of the different acronyms, but you know what you're trained in. Within that, to think about how is that going to apply to a 3-hour intensive one time with a client who's done a ton of therapy versus a 3-day intensive with a client who's never done any therapy, right? Like you might have different ways that you're focusing that. So some people have chosen, when it comes to either an individual or a couple, the first day is focused entirely on some kind of resourcing, some kind of psychoeducation, some kind of skill building, assuming that you do get multiple days with these people. And then the other days, depending on how that first day went with resourcing and skill building and identifying again, what are those goals? Did those goals change as a result of some of the resourcing and psychoeducation that happened? Then you can spend subsequent days doing any kind of processing. And again, depending on your form of therapy, it doesn't mean that you have to do, all right, we've got 3 hours, EMDR the whole time. That's a lot of EMDR. If someone can do that, that's great. But traditionally, you're probably also spending the first 10 to 15 minutes checking in, setting the goals, reminding people, here's what our protocol is going to look like. Here's when you stop me. Here's when we talk. Here's when we don't talk. Right? Like, what's even the plan for? Are we breaking after 90 minutes? How long is that break? When do we come back for the next 90 minutes if we're doing a 3-hour? So kind of 15 minutes of just that like traditional startup. And then you've got 2 hours, 2.5 hours of any kind of processing. And then you've got some time to wrap up, talk about the next day, the next steps, whatever that is. So depending on the modalities you are trained in, you will probably know best of how to break that all up. So again, the piece comes to how much time do you have? Because what you could be thinking about is, well, do we have multiple triggers or memories that we're processing, or are we just doing one? Some people will come in to the intensive with, I've just got this one thing I want to work through, and actually they end up working through 4. Or some people have 5 things they want to work through, and they end up only working through 1. So the nature of intensive therapy is that some of the beauty and the maybe frustrations is like flexibility is the name of the game. Like being flexible with, you might have your treatment plan. You might have, here's how we're gonna spend these minutes, this day, next time, whatever that is. And people's brains and nervous systems kind of go wherever they want. So they don't always coordinate or cooperate. That's rather the word when it comes to, right, like our clinical reasoning. And that's okay. Like the intensive process is all about we get more time to open things up, right? When we have 45 to 60 minutes, clients kind of know that too. They're like, well, there's this deeper stuff I can go into, but we've got 5 minutes left. Like, I don't think I'm going to go there. So it seems like the client is doing one way week to week, but then actually, okay, now I've got 3 hours with them. They feel okay opening up a little bit more. And so that might inform what you're doing with your different modalities as well. Of, like I've said, there have been plenty of times where I do 10 minutes of EMDR and then we talk for half an hour because they're still making sense of stuff and something was actually a little bit more overwhelming than they thought it would be. And then we go back into like 20 minutes of EMDR and then we come back out for talking for an hour, whatever it is. The point being is you get to be flexible. Your client also gets to be flexible. There are plenty of times where, for multiple reasons, if I've had, this past weekend, I just had a 2-day intensive. We did Friday, Sunday, which was why I was like, that doesn't make sense, but it was Friday, Sunday. And when we got to the end of Friday, we did it for 3 hours on Friday. The individual was like, I kind of feel like I worked through everything. I'm not really sure that there's much that I can process on Sunday. Like, should we push that out? Should we reschedule? Like, what would you recommend? And my recommendation was like, it depends, because it can really be super open in that case, right? Like I gave the option of, yes, we can push out, we can see how all this information is settled and processed for you, and then maybe you get some insight over the next month and we can come back to that. Or even over a day and a half, you're gonna sleep a couple of times, your brain's gonna continue processing in the background. So maybe we come back Sunday morning and you feel a little bit differently or something else made sense. And so we agreed, let's meet on Sunday. I said if we wrap up at 60 or 90 minutes, we wrap up at 60 or 90 minutes, even though we're scheduled for 3 hours. That's totally fine. Came in on Sunday morning and she's like, yep, I thought of the entire list of things that I want to get to today. So the thing is, like, you can be flexible. The piece you want to consider about with how flexible you are is like financial, right? Like I would have had to have made a decision if we were scheduled for 3 and we actually stopped at 90 is, well, do I schedule for the time that they've scheduled on my calendar? Or do I schedule just for how long we've met? That's going to be personal preference for everyone. I personally chose, well, we ended up meeting for the whole 3 hours, so it was fine, but my intention would have been if we wrapped up earlier, I was not going to charge for the full amount because I was still making my intensive rate, so wasn't going to nickel and dime people. But again, you can be flexible with, okay, we're starting with this presenting concern, but actually it turned into this thing. Okay, maybe we're not going to get to those things until we do another session, or maybe that's the stuff that you bring back to your other therapist. So all those kind of guiding pieces to think about, always start with a really comprehensive consult. So if you're on the phone, if you do Zoom video consults, that's what I do for mine. You can consider any kind of HIPAA compliant form that someone can complete beforehand. It doesn't have to be as extensive as an intake form, but it can give you a little bit of a sense of where are they at? Do they already have a therapist? What are generally the things they would want to focus on? For me, I have a click box of like recent trauma, historical trauma, couples therapy, something like that. So something that can just give you a little bit more information so you know how to prep for that consultation call. And then if they move forward from the consult, then you have a comprehensive intake. So you can choose, do we do this the same day? Do we do it on a different day? I prefer to do it separately so that I have a sense of a few days before the intensive, okay, we're thinking we're going to do brain spotting. We're thinking we're going to focus on these goals. But then actually once I've heard everything, then that's where I can start to do my clinical reasoning and judgment around, it actually sounds like we might want to start with this thing over here, and maybe we do a little bit of not brain spotting work before we come back to doing all this stuff over here. So you get to have say in that as well. And then again, you're thinking about How many hours do you have across potentially how many days? It might be 1, it might be 2 or 3. What works with the client's schedule and their finances. That's a huge piece because some people are like, I maybe want to do 1 3 to 4 hour every month or every other month. Okay, well then that might determine how you do the work in the modality that you do. Because I'm not trained in ERT, but I work with therapists who are. And what it sounds like is, with ART, you target one thing, you can basically clear it out. So you might be fine with like, cool, and I'll see you again in 2 months for potentially a different target. But if I'm doing EMDR or brain spotting with someone and we didn't get to like a comfortable resolution by the end of those, whatever the intensive was, 3 hours, 4 hours, 2 days, whatever, I don't think I'd be comfortable with like, okay, see you in 2 months, because if the client left dysregulated, like that would be really difficult for me personally in terms of kind of leaving them out there. So that's where, again, you can be flexible and express your clinical judgment around, like, I get that finances might be a barrier. You might be budgeting how much you can spend on this intensive very intentionally. So I get that. And maybe that means we're spending 30 minutes of the wrap up grounding and stabilizing, as opposed to like, let's do all the processing we can up until like the very last intensive minute. So think about that piece too. What happens if a client resolves their concerns more quickly than expected, right? Do you keep going? Do you see what else is there? What else can we dig up? What else can we do work with? Or actually, what happens if the client feels really stuck and isn't making their expected progress, right? Like you've been doing, I just did this maybe a month and a half ago. The person was like, I want to do EMDR. So I was like, great, let's do EMDR. And like for an hour, like they just could not break this barrier of actually touching into their body and their emotions. So we transitioned into a little bit of talk therapy, and then I transitioned them into brain spotting, and that went really, really well. So flexibility, again, like I said, not just in terms of what the goals are, how you're spending the time, how you're using your modality, but just like literally what you're doing in the intensive time. That's one of the most frequent questions I get is, well, what do you actually do during it? Like, your modality, what you're trained in, how to do what you do. It's just, the arbitrary title of it's a therapy intensive that makes some people question, should there be something different that I'm doing? Do I have to be trained to do this in this way? And quite honestly, not really. You just have more time, and there's a little bit more clinical reasoning and judgment that goes behind that. So that's really what I want you all to take away with, is some of those guiding questions to think about. And then again, your modality probably better than I do, especially if like I'm not trained in it. So just think about how that is gonna extrapolate and move into a different type of setting, not a 45, not a 50-minute, not a 60-minute appointment. So if there are any questions, I will leave some time for you all to ask that in the chat. And as always, if you are watching the replay, you can ask in the chat, you can ask via Messenger if you're more comfortable with that. But otherwise, I appreciate those of you who could make it live. I appreciate those of you who are watching the replay. I hope you all have a good rest of your day. If you are curious to get more support around building up your intensives, marketing them, all of that kind of good stuff, there's plenty of other free trainings in this group, as well as my coaching program that I have where I'm supporting other therapists. Hi, Andrea, nice to see you again. So feel free to reach out if you are looking for any help, and otherwise I will see you next time. Bye, everyone.